Okay, is everyone ready? Okay.
I value morality, Christian, and 12, the way in English to state the moral principles with all prefer this conception. 1, justice-based reasoning, moral reasoning motivates care, gesture, and Yoder, and 16. Justice sensitivity linked between perceived injustice and moral motivation, perceiving injustice, strong motivation to act, empathy, critical role, injustice, motivation, cognitive empathy, correlated with justice sensitivity. 4, others, cognitive reasoning, wide and empathy, and moral judgment, significantly correlated with different LPV attitude, attitudes more effective to focus on reasoning to elicit empathetic concern for others than emphasizing emotional sharing with the misfortune of others leads to distress and not necessarily motivation for upholding principles for justice for all. And 2, moral frames are persuasive and heighten moral conviction, where non-moral frames simply make us more certain, and extreme framing on as an impact-based demoralizes their impact with current subjectivity shifts covered it all in 22. Attitudes and moral conditions significantly more moralized, non-moral frames increase certainty, extremity does not have a significant effect on importance and centrality. Moral conviction is a distinct dimension of attitudinal strength. Moral conviction is a unique dimension of attitude strength, and non-natural material moral truths do not stem from natural facts. One naturalistic definitions can encompass the definition of the good and are ontological as moral truths. Chapter 1 and 21. Good is what we desire. To desire is to good. To desire A. To desire A. Intelligible. Each token real thought distinction and meaning to as complicated as tokens do not mean the same. Good, how does the differently from desire, pleasure is pleasant, state of mind is different, good, not identical to pleasant. And 2, only operator knowledge is absolutely reliable. Descartes 41. Is there not a God who puts me into thoughts I am now having? I may be the author of these thoughts. I have no sense in nobody. If I am convinced myself of something that I certainly exist, there is a deceiver, a supreme power who is deceiving me. He will never bring it about that I have nothing. Most finally conclude I exist. I do not yet have a sufficient understanding of what the I is. And 3, it's fallacious to say that descriptive not applies existing applies to prescriptive claim to goodness. Academy and no date is not gap way things that cannot be evidence for way things ought to be. It applies to biology. Everyone over the limit, all right for me. And there are 3 ways categories of substance and non-natural properties, initially, externally, and constitutional as being constitutivism is a meta-ethical and meta-ontological determinant for the validity of moral theories. 1, normativity of both integralist and externalist theories of ethics fail to be either merely optional or non-universal constituent solves. We can not participate in an action without a constitutive aim to that action. For instance, playing chess always necessitates achieving checkmate, even if it doesn't require that we have fun. Christophe 14. Internalism has trouble universal norm claims. I wonder how a claim that bears no relation to our motives and motivational external generates universal norm claim yet encounters the problems of crack new is constitutive of the agreed that truth depends on aim power traces the authority aim that is constitutive of true obligations or constitutive of features that define different entities. Each 56 good attributive not predictive B cannot safely say predictive of A what we can predicate of A good is not aliens red car and good car no possibility of ascertaining good car by independent information, and the only constitutive non-natural property is our ability to set and pursue ends or practically reason. 1, regress ethical theories must have a basis. We can ask why we follow the basis of a theory, so they are morally binding because they don't have a starting point. Practical reason solves. We ask why we follow a reason. We demand a reason which concede the authority of reason itself, making reason constitutive of any justification to inescapability. Every agent intrinsically values practical reason when they go about studying and pursuing an end on moral theories. It presupposes the end that they're committing is an intrinsic good that necessitates practical reason as a necessary means to follow through on any given action. 3, action theory riddle in 07. Suppose I walk from A to B, B to C, or A to C. Only in the latter case, walking from A to C, action is not aggregate, and that justifies universal moral law. CR in 99. When I represent my end, I represent it as binding to certain courses of action. Thus, my ends determine what I can do to representing an end. I demand recognition from other subjects since the end functions as an objective for me. I cannot be indifferent. Hence, if I am committed to realizing my end, I demand any worth of my end be recognized by others. In absent universalist ethics, morality is far should be merely supplied in different ways without reason. Non-arbitrariness is a second train only on non-arbitrary principles can hold agents culpable for their actions. Otherwise, we could make up different ethical rules for different situations to punish people. Therefore, in order to respect each agent as a practical reasoner, we require a universal set of moral laws that what accounts as a violation of the categorical rational reflection. That's the categorical imperative. It has 4 formulations for Proto, and 2. A theory of good lies in the category of active or maximum granting universal law, always treating many as an end. Activist rule can regard itself as making a law through maxims. Activists who are a lawmaking member of the kingdom of ends. And thus, the standards consist of the category imperative and active law, not a will towards after unification. 1, moral worth is grounded in autonomy and a continuous process. Gibson in 20. Attempt for self-unification ongoing. All people have value because the promise of self-unification comes from the sense of agency, value of non-unified agents, extent to which they engage in activity, becoming unified. Freedom exists when making the choice, value of our own autonomy and necessity. Normativity is the process of self-unification. Value derived from agency must begin exists prior to unification. 2, psychology. Agents intuitively prefer sense of agency, body, and all in 09. Sense of agency, magnify emotional responses that intensify positive effect. People are confronted with their choices that intentionally affect well-being and still prefer to make these choices. Desire for choice in spite of its consequences contributed to selecting the option that matches personal preference. 3, is evolutionarily advantageous. Everett and 16. Deontology comes from the evolution of morality. Agents are more likely to be chosen as cooperation orders, thus increasing their own fitness. Deontologists are vision of certain acts interfere with trustworthiness because claims of all rule-based judgments associated with the reliability of moral behavior. Deontological judgments indicate cooperative behavior. Expressing deontological judgment may indicate that a person has a set of socially valued emotional responses that make them attractive social partners. Studies show that individuals who have made deontological decisions are more empathetic and have a superior moral character and impact. How 1, use epistemic confidence. A, impossible to determine probability of framework often being true using scalar body. Modesty assumes that if you outside universal knowledge or judge basis on whether certain arguments are true or true without committed equity. Intense versus A. Induction fails. Anderson is UK. Objects with characters A. All possess B. Conclude that all, or actually just give the card. It's illogical to say that something can be true based on the past because it requires knowing the past in order to predict the future, which presumes that we know that the past is reliable in the first place. B, predictions fail. Men in 05. A long-term study of 284 people asking the probability in areas where states have selected study made 82,361 forecasts for more extent if they unequal party. All three outcomes are poor forecasts in dark throwing monkeys. And skip the last part. I contend the United States also become a party to the Rome Statute, the ICC 1 universal ethics, a non-arbitrariness, the IC a neutral arbitrator, which rules on terminations of dignity and rational reflection, which is the key to resolving moral uncertainty. P of violations of dignity and rights like oppression are non-universalizable, which demands a universally recognized judiciary that punishes categorically wrong actions and strengthens obligate will. That's the ICC. Hence, in 18 states, Western rights subject lawless freedom to public or coercive laws and form an international scene. The state and international community are called upon to protect human dignity by the way of criminal law. Human dignity is the moral source of rights and ultimately have to be protected by universal interculturally recognized criminal law world community manifesting moral duties beyond the state common to all originating in wrong is a hindrance to a freedom in which universal laws common humanity dignity must be enforced on a super or transnational law. Cardinal law. Two kingdom ends universal recognition and punishment of rights violations through ICC ranked as in the framework individual treated as ends in himself rather than a means to end, which are intrinsic to the state of nature and rightful interaction between states and the state of nature and possible states are always being in a constant state of war absent of laws defining territory and procedure for interaction. That's resolved by U.S. Joining ICC because it governs the outright interaction of the Republican state and defines property rights, which means that states becoming part of the treaty is a good thing because it strengthens all the outer will. So I just didn't read the Pope card, the Shelby card, and then I caught the Haynes card as law, and I cut the Farr card and the Anderson card and just made it analytically.
Okay, you have process?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, my first question is about agency. What constitutes agency, or what is the most important part about agency?
Yeah, so agency is the ability to practically reason. What this means is that you have the ability to set an end and pursue that.
Okay, sure. So the ability to set and pursue an end, would that be hindered by something like death? Would that be an impact according to your framework?
No.
Why not?
Because we have made the claim that life is instrumentally valuable, not intrinsically valuable. Nowhere have we said that you must be alive, just that while you are alive, you must have the ability to express your will.
So like if extinction happened, that wouldn't be something that could hinder the possibility of reasoners to act, or could not hinder the categorical imperative?
No, because our framework does not care about whether you are alive. It's just a question of what you do while you're alive.
Okay, that's fine. Next question, what does the top of the framework mean when it says that it's relevant that we value morality?
We think that the resolution is a moral question, which means that all frameworks ought answer the moral question of the resolution.
Okay, so if I win, for example, that something like racism is immoral, then do I win the round?
If you read an impact that is racism and you've justified why racism is immoral, then yes.
Okay. Alright, let's go to the framework section, specifically non-naturalism. The Descartes evidence, what does it mean that only a priori knowledge is morally accessible?
I cannot be certain that the empirical world that I'm observing is verifiable or real, but I can be certain that I'm thinking.
So is it possible then to verify, so you're saying that it's impossible then to verify that events such as like the Indian Removal Act or on the entirety of European colonization of the Americas did not occur?
Yeah, our argument would be that we are not certain that that is the case, but we are certain that we are thinking.
So if people that like have experienced things directly related to this colonialism, and they can tell their story, they can tell their account, we cannot then verify that it's true?
You can't verify that their experience is true, but you should still respect them as an agent.
Okay, so that has nothing, so then that is not something that can implicate itself in your framework, any kind of experience that has to do with naturalism.
We would say that it's arbitrary to allow ethics to be guided based on the way people experience things. We should just do this universally.
Okay, so no. Next, last question. Farr, it talks about abstracting.
I didn't read that part.
Okay. Then. Okay, that's fine. The order will be one-off case.
Before you go into the does anyone have any questions about the app? So someone give me a summary of what the app framework says.
People are visitors, and we have to respect their ability to reason.
Yes, right? Agents are reasoners, which means what? What is reason based on cross-X?
The ability to set and pursue ends.
Yes, setting and pursuing ends, right? Okay, and then what's the next step of the framework? Nelson, you have something? After we're reasoners, all of us are agents that can set and pursue ends. What's the conclusion of that, as per the Kant framework?
We can make universal ethics.
Yeah, so because we are all rational agents, that means that we must treat others the way that we expect ourselves to be treated, and therefore we should respect each other's rational agency, i.e. our freedom to set and pursue ends, right? Someone want to give me an explanation of what the contention says? What is the reason why the ICC is a good thing as per the Aff? Jubang?
I think the first one says the ICC holds people culpable and then respects dignity.
Okay, good, right? So the ICC prosecutes things like war crimes and genocide, which is a universal standard that we should not allow other countries to commit, right? Good, so that is a good summary of the 1AC. The 1NC will be, obviously he said one off, right? So it will be one sheet of paper, then the affirmative.
One sheet of paper to K.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And then case will just be the 1AC top down. Is everyone ready?
Did you send it?
Yeah, I sent it like a while ago.
Okay.
Oh, wait, it's in the slide?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Good? Good. Okay. The 118's model of debate is structured by settler colonialism, absent of firm engagement with our repressed desire. Every move of settlers take in intuitions produced on indigenous land is overdetermined by genocide, a desire to absolve guilt and erase indigeneity. Thus, the role of the ballot is one of the best methodology that actively resists settler colonialism. That's Corey Scott Mark 15. For us as settlers, the engagement with indigenous ways of knowing how to unsettle our identity to recreate ourselves in ethical ways. We remap settled subjectivity through a relational ontology founded through higher sense of unconscious. There is inevitably the disorientation, a longing for the return to who we were before. We iteratively are composed in relation to an infinitely proliferating series of catastrophes. In the settlement, the unconscious is the space of repression. This term settler signifies that which must not and cannot be spoken because it is taboo. The settler is constituted by desire to within a lack the image lost fullness of the nation. Settlers are bound by affective essence in the other that prevent the realization of this. Lack comes to manifest itself as a painful and traumatic substitutes the unconscious produces the settler. It's in for a subjectivity overwhelmed and guilt. The settler must believe that all harms and accountability has no contemporary actuality. The history in which indigenous people develop complex politics and spirituality is to be selectively denied and subsumed within European models. Foreground the settlers are origin point reiterated with abstract accounts of policy sanitizes corporeal encounters between bodies. The land has cultural termination, delivered for disease, and it's possible for the deaths of 90% of the population. The Nile through repression can only be sustained through ongoing violence and the integration of a self-production which is going to be repressed in the service of ways that warp the capacities and reject idle theory, assuming a standpoint of epistemology where we can adopt a viewpoint of the oppressed that serves as a account for the wrong ideology which cure our thought process. That's those 5. What distinguishes ideal theory is idealization of the exclusion. What is the actual? The ideal theory represents the actual as a deviation. The ideal moral theory cannot avoid a characterization of human beings. Will assume that the ideal social ontology will assume that the equal autonomic individuals will stop away from the relations of the oppression which profoundly shape their ontology of the individuals. From the ideal theory, nothing will be said on historical oppression and transparency will be presumed in distorting perceptions of social order. And the alternative is refusal. This is a generative proxy towards the decolonial futures that must be crushed make way for the astral genocide horizon as King 17. Generative refusal of decolonial abolition tradition is making what the Western thought upon itself settler colonial knowledge, making the settler colonial meta-narrative the object of research, question the assumptions and exposes the violent particularities of the meta-narrative. Refusal reverses the erasure enacted by European theory, which uses genocide to annihilate native epistemologies. When the U.S. as practice genocide itself ceases to exist, the native people can exist as human. The United States can no longer determine the conditions for being human. Studies can look to black and brown native resistance as a Praxian theory that shifts the term of identity. Our interpretation of the debate is that the judge should evaluate the act as an object of research based on its ability to influence the act and the subjectivity and capacity to forward a model of resistance to settler colonialism. Winning a link is the reason that the framework justifies a violent action. Winning a link is the reason that the framework justifies violent action should be rejected. The interpretation must therefore include the alternate entire event of anything else is separate. The smooth interpretation of settlerism in academic cases reproduces colonial subjects and interpreting it as the only real impact of the realm that's headers in 17. Settlers must answer the charge that their daily life is predicated upon genocide. Settlers' position on occupied land is sustained through defensive posture. The decolonization must include analysis of the subject. Settler colonialism means subverted critic cracks in the wholeness. Pursue restoring the settlement methodologies, resistance occurs in reader, dispute acts, repetitive practice of everyday life, and against settled faces their meaning in the case page. Their syllogism requires that when all 3 parts of their framework, non-naturalism, universalizability, and the standard is proving any of them is a sufficient reason to negate. Now, their philosophy is built on genocide, metaphysical dualism, justify and inform settler colonialism by creating and upholding distinctions between the rational and the irrational subject. These distinctions are both historically and contingently reliant on the position of the irrational savage. Start 19. Modern philosophy was characterized by its dualism between civilized and savage. They are not only philosophical ideas, abstracts. Metaphysics became an ideology of expedition African, and indigenous peoples were pictured as the sheer bodies, while the European thinkers were minds. The white supremacy lurks at the heart of Western metaphysics. The ethics of the Kant emphasized the one that's to be rational to be re-actualized externally is that after the way domination of the other color roles. Kant argues that irrational creatures can be treated as means. There's claims on person. People that is irrational opens up to the use. The reason is a power that we have to virtue. Says course guard protected outward. It makes necessary the control of the animals and people. It is not suggesting course guard rights premises, but the metaphysics that they endorse all grew up to be with white premises that help shape it. Their whole picture is subject to its social application, which has been oppressive. And the lemon proper non-naturalism being bad. A, it justifies ignoring the lived experience of indigenous folks who settler, which is settler moves to innocence and a refusal and a form of denial of guilt. They cannot get away from saying events like the IRA or Wounded did not happen, and even if they do, then it means that this definitely cannot solve and form their politics. So if we win that settler colonialism is a unique thing that influences the world, then the only way to resolve that is to recognizing these events and dealing with the particularities that they produce. And the shackle evidence, racism is a side constraint on good action. We don't need to have an all-encompassing access to the good. If we use things like racism to deduce if the moral theory is acceptable or not, for example, if util was racist, we would accept that is not a theory that we should apply. 2, constitutivism. Corey hijacked this in practical reason because it concludes that our colonial desires are sort of trapped within the lack and in order to sort of form the repressed desire to form the lost nation state. And the practical reason evidence, 1, straight agency. The people can shift their obligation to be a straight agent, which means that he never holds anyone culpable. And 2, problem of other minds. Absent induction, there's no way to know who else is a reasoner, which means that the framework creates problematic gray areas to determine who has agency historically deployed, which has historically been deployed against natives. And 3, if reason is inescapable, then our bad actions in the past prove that it is racist because they were acting with reason, or it is escapable, which means that the framework is not binding. And 4, even if everyone is an agent, indigenous people aren't viewed as such, given their thesis, which demonstrates how their practical knowledge will always be skewed by Kant himself didn't think that natives were reasoners. And on the other rule evidence, A, Gibson racism is a violation of subject's autonomy, which is that, so you're not a totally subject within the settler economy, which makes them not as valuable. And B, Bodhi, clinical desire ensures that neuroscience gets co-opted by things like craniometry, which is white supremacists using science to justify racist things. And the impact calculus stuff, A, induction is good and robust, that's doubting. And Miller, 19, and researchers understand where past features goes wrong and improve upon it, rectifying problems to make it a better prediction. Expertise requires direct feedback on performance prediction, implies something which are verifiable. Just a successful prediction constitutes better evidence than accommodation. If theory enables predictions to work we ask models for the reality theorizing is not knowledgeable. The extent that it's predicted, the problem with complexity is specific empirical details, and the beaming on is less specific and unverified. Rigorous condensation of empirics ensures more accurate predictions. And the offense page proper, all their arguments are reliant on proving that the ICC is a non-biased and non-problematic actor, but it isn't. A98 shields the U.S. from the court's jurisdiction and the Security Council membership, ensures the ICC is used for geopolitical interests. That's Chauncey 16. Jurisdiction under the statutory rules political pressure is more powerful than complementary. The ICC is not less likely to interfere with powerful states' ability to carry out sufficient investigation as cause resentment. The A98 for the court cannot perceive whether state parties already have an obligation. Third parties ASBA forbade government cooperating and authorize any necessary action free any American soldiers. The U.S. ultimately will be shielded from jurisdiction. The argument U.S. argument that its justice system is willing to prosecute can succeed. The Security Council has referred non-party states in Libya. The purpose behind regime change. The Security Council can suspend the investigation of any court crime. The prosecutor is likely to be just as vulnerable. The gravity is not defined as vague and can be used inconsistently. And the U.S. participation in the ICC's shareholder economy would only make the courts an extension of empire. That's Candle 15. The ICC relies upon annual funding from its member states, producing a shareholder economy that draws upon managerial logics regarding states as shareholders. Austerity at the level of practice. A reduced budget is essential threat to the ICC. Preoccupation with the private realm. The work of the court to secure contributions. If you provide us with contributions to meet the budget, you will see this quantity of justice presentation of criminal law as investments.
Good for cross.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just like a okay. The thesis. What is the lack?
Yeah. So it is something that sort of always the subject can never reach. Something that the subject literally always lacks. Sort of a connection. Something that they lack is like connection to the land that they sort of always try to fill. So
so how can the alternative give like back this conception of the land if it's an unreachable goal?
No, our argument. So the important thing to recognize is that the goal is not to fill the lack. That is the problem with the affirmative. It's a problem with many settler actions. The thing to do is not to reach the lack, but to recognize that it exists and to recognize the problems of trying to fill it.
Also, where have you made a claim that objective moral truth doesn't exist?
We have made claims that the 1AC is racist. We've made claims that the 1AC is incapable of generating moral truths that are capable of combating
about the thesis claim, right?
Settler colonialism.
Your thesis claim would seem to indicate that objective moral truth doesn't exist, considering we're trying to find a wholeness that's impossible. The 1AC has presented multiple arguments that say objective moral truth does exist. Where have you combat this idea?
Right, so the 1 and C, I don't think that we have to be held to this idea of objective moral truth. That is not the language used in our evidence. our card talks about problems and ways that settlers
So,
justify their actions
if
on stolen
objective
land.
moral
We have
truth
said that the
existed-
affirmative is a form of that justification.
Yeah, so if objective moral truth existed, would it not be the case that we could find wholeness by reaching that objective moral truth?
No, because we think that the forms of universal objective moral truth are something that never responds to particularities of circumstances of oppression.
Okay.
Things like the forms of settler colonialism that
fine.
influence
What
different
is
people in
ideal
different
theory?
ways, change their relationships, their ontology,
Yeah, that's fine.
influence their normative obligations.
What is ideal theory?
The affirmative idea that we can abstract away from the conditions of the real world and then assign people obligations based on that ideal world. People should act based off what would happen if we were in this perfect world.
Okay, can you explain to me the alternative, please?
The alternative is a refusal from the app in favor of alternative methodologies. So in the context of, for example, ethics, we think it would be important to forward things like native spiritualities, things that
It seems
things
like
that
you
are
have
important.
abstracted away from the current world of the status quo and said that people should embrace native spirituality.
Those
What
things
is the
exist. Those
distinction
are real
between
things,
this and
Spencer.
saying that people should respect agency?
I don't understand your question.
Well, your explanation of why ideal theory was bad is that it detracts away from the SWO looks like and says what the perfect world looks like. And then your explanation of the alternative is
Yeah,
the
but
SWO
the
is
alternative
bad,
is-
but the best world looks like
So
respecting
here's the
indigenous
difference.
agency,
The alternative
which
is
doesn't happen.
political. It prescribes a course of action to get there. It
But
says
you
we
just
should
said that
respond to settler
prescriptive
state.
actions based on
And
an
it is-
ideal world are bad.
Yeah, in the
right?
context of a research method, we think that in the idea of what a political strategy should look like, that is a different question that I can also answer, but you did not ask me
So
that
why is
question.
the 1AC not a political strategy? It joins the
How is
ICC
it?
and has
It
an
just says-
example of why that's a good idea.
Yeah, and we have prescribed that your political strategy is insufficient.
So there's no ideal theory link?
What? Of course there is. There we
But
made
if
arguments by the
1AC is a
ICC.
political strategy, then it's not ideal, no?
We have every link to the 1AC is a reason why your political strategy is not sufficient and is actively racist.
Okay. I'll take some.
Okay. Anyone have a sense of what the 1C argument is? Can you please explain? What is the core argument the 1C makes? Yeah, Kim?
The 1AC is built on a need for genocide and violence.
Okay, and that is the thesis time of the critique, right? So the argument is functionally that the world is structured around this idea that we are trying to fulfill a settler fantasy, that we can somehow create the perfect image of what it means to have a white world, right? And that comes at the cost of indigenous people's rights and lives, right? Now, what are the link arguments that the 1C makes to the affirmative? Why does the affirmative support this idea? Yeah.
One of them is ideal theory.
Okay, what's the argument that's made?
That the fact that we're looking at the world from an objective point of view erases experiences and things.
Okay, so the argument is that abstracting away from the way that the world is, rather than looking at the way that the world is and trying to combat that, abstracts us away from the experience reality of certain people, right? What was the cross-ex question that illustrates a difference between the idea of the affirmative and the idea of the negative on this question? So what did Swickle ask Harris in cross-ex? That makes it seem that there is combating ideas about what it means to have a universal ideal of something. So there's a cross-ex exchange in which Swickle asks, what does it mean to have an ideal theory, right? And so the argument that Harris presents is that moral abstraction, in the sense that we are trying to pull ethics out of nowhere, right, is bad. But political strategies that look at what a good version of politics might be is not the same type of thing that the affirmative is trying to engage in, right? So that will be a debate that seems to be relevant for the 1AR given the amount of time that cross-ex spends on it, right? Is there another link to the affirmative? Justin?
The dualism link.
What's the argument?
It's like the modern philosophy of Kant is characterized by the dualistic nature, separating the mind from the empirical. This leads to conceptions of native people as civilized and savage, which is the form of genocide that the negative is critiquing.
Good, right. So this is a further contextualization of why the specific framework of the affirmative is an example of this ideal theory criticism, right? Which is that it abstracts away from the lived experience of people by saying that the world is structured by something that is non-natural or not empirical, right? And that is the place in which we get ethics from. And builds on that idea by saying that other cultures don't view the world that way, and criticizing those cultures by saying that they are wrong for the way that they approach the world might have racial implications, right? Are there any other arguments that you think are super important in the 1 and C? Jubei.
Probably some answers to the framework. Like,
Okay, yeah, so the 1 and C does a pretty solid job of line by lining the half framework, right? This is important because, of course, the entire debate is about whether the affirmative framework and approach to the topic is correct, right?
Yep.
And so a 1 and C that reads a critique, just because they are different types of arguments, does not mean that you should not engage with the actual substance of the affirmative, right? So I think Harris does a good job here of being like, not only is your framework racist, we have made reasons for why your framework is also actively incorrect, right? Which I think is another layer to the debate that if you're reading a K, you should definitely be able to do because it makes it a lot harder for the 1AR, right? Were there any framing arguments that might be important for the 1AR to answer or that the 2NR is trying to set up? Come in.
When the 1 and C said that they have to like prove both the like meta-ethical standard and I forgot something else.
Yeah, so Harris makes a framing argument that's like, in order for them to win their framework, they must win all 3 steps of their syllogism, right? Which I think is a good thing to point out because it shifts the burden of the affirmative from being able to win one of these things to take out the critique to all of these things in order to win the affirmative, right? What other framing arguments? There's I think 2 other framing arguments that are important that are in the actual 1 and C that the 1AR probably has to deal with. Jubei.
evaluate the round as an object of research.
Okay, yes, so a K framework insert, right? That's like, not only should we evaluate the policy action of the affirmative, we should also evaluate the representations, right? Or the research practices of the affirmative. This is important because, of course, many of the links that were read in the 1 and C are about the representations and research practices of the affirmative, right? And I think the last argument that's important is the top of the 1 and C that says that the role of the ballot is to determine the best methodology for resisting colonial oppression, something along those lines, which means that the 1 and C frames the debate down to a specific type of impact that is relevant, right? So if the affirmative makes arguments for why, like, they solve things that are not related to anti-indigenous violence, then the 2NR can say, well, those arguments don't matter because you conceded our role of the ballot. So that seems like another important argument for the 1AR to address, right? So we good? Cool. So the 1AR will now attempt to address all those issues.
Okay. There's one card, so I'll send that.
So are we going to do that after this?
What's that?
With like fun of this?
This step.
Okay. When everyone gets the card and like, downloads it, let me know.
Whenever Harris is ready, we're ready.
Yeah, I'm good. Does someone have a phone I can use for a timer?
Here.
Okay.
Ethics must be constituted for obligation to have normative force. They must be categorically binding because otherwise actors contingently disregard them, which outweighs the K because it means we can arbitrarily apply ethics in different instances. Only contingentivism can solve, which means that even if you have the most racist index, you can apply it. Only our framework resolves because it requires ethics to be constituted. Only practical reason is inescapable. Reasoning whether to engage in this practice is conducted external to that practice through intentional agency, which is exercising rationality. Respect for that rationality should be universal as maxims should apply to everyone in all instances of action. The standards consist with the principles of category period of the respect agency universally enforced through a collection of wills. Drop all pieces of offense. You drop the first piece of offense, which says that it's not arbitrary. The IC is a neutral arbitrator which relies on which rules on terminal violations of dignity and rational reflection, which is key resolving moral uncertainty, which turns the K because it means that we have a form of resolving uncertainty over the issues of things like A98, 6, and Anderson evidence. Flow drop. The induction fails. The logical prediction is circular in order to prove induction should fail. else we must use induction, i.e. say, we only know induction works because it is in the past. However, there's no logical certainty that a situation will be replicated exactly line by line. They say that we need to win all three parts of the framework. Disproving any is enough. No, non-naturalism is not a necessary feature of our framework. We do not need to win that. That is necessarily true that all ethics exist in the non-natural world, just that it's a possibility which they haven't denied, and all the list line by line. Anyways, this horrible evidence to mischaracterization, which isn't intrinsic to the framework. Just because people have misapplied it doesn't mean the framework is wrong, but just that people are bad at applying Kant the same way people are bad at applying Settler. It's also wrong because we are Kant, we are neo-Kant, we are a new adaptation of this argument, which we don't rely on the same conceptions that they critique. Non-naturalism means ignore lived experience. The argument is wrong. It means that they shouldn't be the basis for ethics. Anything else justifies the worst of the opposite side, i.e. accommodating for a racist experience, and that being justified, which means universal ethics solves, because it means we can never use any experience as the basis for it. Racism is intuitively wrong is wrong. You've conceded every card at the top of the app that says that it is good to justify why racism is wrong. You've dropped that justice-based moral reasoning motivates care, which means we have an active reason why we care for settler colonialism, and you drop the other argument that is more persuasive and stops you from being extreme, which was called drop the agency argument. You are being an agent by saying that you'd be a agent, which means you concede the authority of agent. The problem of other minds is resolved by ideal theory, because it would mean that we know who agents are in the ideal world. Racism double mind is wrong. It's a misunderstanding of reason. It's not a misapplication of reason, because reason is the ability to set and pursue ends, not to practically think properly. The next argument about science being used to justify racism, crossed by the argument about misapplications, the A98 arguments. It's about the Security Council, not the Rome Statute. It's also the extension of the Empire argument is wrong, because they haven't. Because it's a consequentialist argument which they've dropped are incoherent. The only other argument they have is this a card that says that predictions do work, but our argument is about the logic of predictions, not whether or not predictions are possible, which is a different argument, because we've made it a logical fallacy, not whether or not it's possible to make in the first place. Okay. You lose the bad and only value the resolution, not representations, predictability, infinite numbers of infinite replicates and words and nuances of the framework. Fairness outweighs all 1C. Arguments require fairness to be validated. Search for rejection is paradoxical by nature, and we wouldn't internalize their lesson and chalk it up to an unfair decision, which turns affective events. Mr. Round should be saved on accusations of in-round violence, technically litigating them is problematic. We won't change our minds if we call it racist for dropping an argument. The judge dropping us for racism, absent technical evaluation, tells us that we are actually problematic. Only that solves the Henderson evidence. All causes, coaching, schools, resources, and next 80 years outweigh 2. Switch side is Francis informing specific beliefs to be used to sides. 3 debaters read arguments they don't believe in all the time, proven by the Kappa, and debaters working in tech industries. Overview. Constitutivism is meta-ontology, determines what features are actually ethically relevant to ontology in the first place, which my theory says those are constitutive and therefore pass the reduction test. A determination of whether a specific agency or entity can exist absent a specific feature takes out the critique. Indigenous people existed prior to European invasion, and therefore anti-indigeneity physically cannot be constitutive of the subject. Your colonial reading of Swickle that reproduces your impacts, your immense applications, and credit for your author's doubts is not actually the reality of your authors. No author would say you link, you lose, or discussing the government is battle fatigue, which are quotes from your own 2 and R's. This creates a colonized version of their argument, which doesn't translate into broader movements. Your authors would say good and independent voter because it proves that you're moved to innocence. Kant solves racism. It would say that everyone is an agent, which means that racism is obviously bad. The IC is good. Gutter in 21.8. Afghan numbers the highest. Actually, don't read this card. The line by line, the thesis, psychoanalysis, is not possible. Well, you have not justified why we know what is inside of the psyche, and it presumes that you're denying constitutivism. Like, you've dropped that constitutivism is true, which was the overview. The Mills evidence. You link to this argument. Your explanation of the alternative is literally an ideal world where everyone follows the way that we view your conception of indigeneity, and they're not. And a comprehensive theory of justice requires both the ideal and non-ideal theory. You conceded that they have a trade-off with each other, but both are complementary, which means that it's possible to have both, and it's a prerequisite into goal setting, because you need to have an ideal standard that we can point to in the direction of. So non-ideal theory has an explanation of where we can go.
Cool.
Okay. It's a lot of arguments, right? What do we think of the 1 error? How did the 1 error do in terms of answering arguments on the case, answering arguments on the K? Okay, so what arguments did the 1 error go for on the case page?
Oh, constitutive.
Okay, so you went for constitutivism, right? And what's the argument there?
Like, reasoning is constitutive to being agent.
Yeah, the apps framework is constitutive to what it means to be human, right? And how does that compare to the critique?
It outweighs the K because you can apply ethics in different situations.
Okay, good. So he's made an arbitrariness argument on the case that says that anything that is not constitutive to humans is arbitrary or without reason, right? Which means that we can justify responses to other people and treat them differently than other people based on no reason at all, right? Which is kind of the justification for oppression, right? What else does the 1 AR go for on the case page? On the framework.
Like, even if, like, Kant said bad things, like, it doesn't matter, because, like, he's really like an altered version of it, because it's neo-Kantian.
Okay, so he answers one of the link arguments on the case page about Kant as a person, right? And says that that doesn't matter because we haven't read a piece of Kant evidence and that we are some new, super fancy version of Kant that doesn't actually link to this argument, okay? What else?
It's just like the ideal theory link is like not unique since it applies to all. So
Okay, so on the K, he responds to the ideal theory link that says it doesn't matter because the way you explain all in cross-X is the same thing as the ideal theory argument, okay?
And he goes for the offensive, like the contention about how ICC can solve like uncertainty.
Yeah, so this is a super important part of the 1AR, right? So the 1NC does a good job of not only contesting the framework, but also contesting the offense, right? So he says, not only is your framework wrong, right? The topic is racist, your framework is racist, but also, even if your framework is true, your offense is incorrect, which is a great layering argument that every K debater should have, right? Because it means that the 1AR is a lot more difficult and has to be a lot more technical when answering line by line of the app page, right? And this 1AR attempts to answer this argument by saying, you've conceded my contention argument, and I'm going to respond to every case argument that you've made for why the ICC is bad, right? So he line by lines those arguments, which is an important recognition, right? Because if the 1AR concedes a reason for why Kant negates, that means that the 2NR can just say, you've conceded that, I'll concede your framework, but you've conceded that Kant actually flows neg, which is a reason to vote neg automatically, because your only offense in the round is that the ICC is good, right?
There's no privilege.
What else does the 1AR go for on the
Oh, yes, there was on
case
the
page?
ideal
There's one
theory.
more very important argument that the app leverages offensively. Yes?
Induction fails.
Yeah, so he goes for induction fails, or a reason why it is impossible for us to evaluate consequences, or it is illogical for us to evaluate consequences, right? And he says that all of the link arguments and case terms that the negative reads are based on the consequences of what happens after we join the ICC rather than the principle of the ICC intrinsically, right? This is important because it is a good framing argument that can answer all of the neg arguments if the 2AR can win it. Because it means that none of their impacts actually happen if we can't evaluate that they happen, right? So this is a good argument that frames out a lot of what the 1NC says, right? And then on the K, right, what important arguments, did he address all of the important arguments that we pointed out before the 1AR? So let's start at the top, right? So on the rules about stuff, does he answer that the rule of valid should be the best method for resolving anti-indigenous or anti-colonial violence? Shubang?
I think so.
What was the answer?
You link, you lose bad. No author
Okay,
gives it.
so yeah, this is an important thing to point out, right? Which is that the top of the 1NC has a rule of valid that says the only impacts that matter are ones that revolve around resolving anti-indigenous violence, right? And then at the bottom of the critique, he has an argument for why you should evaluate a you link, you lose method, which is if we win a reason that you're racist, you should automatically lose regardless of whether the resolution is a good idea, right? So I think the 1AR has answered the argument that you should vote neg if they win a reason why the app is racist, even if it's not a link to the resolution, but has not necessarily answered the argument that you should vote for the best methodology for resolving colonial violence, right? Which means that the 2NR can say, well, if the 1AR has to resolve anti-colonial violence in order to win the round, right? So who has the best methodology for doing so? And then, as far as the link arguments, did the 1AR answer all the link arguments? So that would be the Mills evidence, and there's another one.
Start 12.
Yeah. The answer is, I think the affirmative covered all the link arguments, right? So there is at least an answer to each link argument in the 1NC, which I think is very important, right? Because any link argument that you concede is a very easy 2NR to give, right? Because if all I have to do is win that you link, you lose is true, or you should lose if you do something racist, and you just concede a link argument, that means that the 2NR can spend all of their time going for the framework page, right? Last thing, is there any floating pieces of offense on the K? Like arguments that just say the K is bad independent of the affirmative.
I heard him like say the words independent voter, but I didn't catch what he was saying.
Okay, so you caught the word independent voter. Did anyone catch the warranting there? Yeah.
It's the idea that the author would that like you're like you're colonizing like the idea of Settler, like the critique of Settler itself by like kind of changing what it's saying. So and that because like authors wouldn't actually like say like verbatim the argument that I think Harris is making.
Yeah, so the argument is that they are a colonized version of setcall that tries to use setcall for the purpose of winning debates and provides a couple of examples of how that might play out, right? So with a settler colonial scholar that is looking at the best way to resolve oppression, say, well, if you say one word that's negative, then we should stop listening to you and stop having this conversation and vote one way. Not necessarily, right? So the argument is that there's a floating piece of offense that just says that their reading of the critique in the manner in which they've read it is bad in debate. In the same way that you say our reading of the affirmative is bad in debate, right? Any questions? What do we think the 2 and R should do?
Go for rolled ballot.
Okay, so potentially go for reasons why it should be the best methodology for resolving colonial violence. What else? What links do you think? Aditya?
Oh, I was gonna say you should probably respond to the fairness stuff and the IBI.
Yeah, so he should definitely respond to the IBI and the framework arguments for why fairness comes first, that you should stake the ground and double down, right? What else? What's the link argument that the 2 and R should go for, do you think? It's kind of a trick question because I think ultimately it's a question of what the 2 and R likes. Like, what argument do you think, because they're all answered to some degree, the question becomes, which do you think your best link argument is, right? So in a world where a link is conceded, you should just go for a conceded link, right? But in a world where the 1AR covers every link, you should choose the best link argument that you have. So which argument do you think is the best against the affirmative in this particular scenario, right? And so we're about to find out what Harris thinks the best link argument is. Yeah. Okay.
That's good. Alright, the order is going to be the K top down on the 1AR, and then the case page starting on induction, and then naturalism, and then the offense page. Okay. This is a debate about debate. Settler colonialism and epistemic product that is further in this round of ways beyond the plan. Thus, the confines of a decision must be extended beyond fiat to consider the larger unconscious assumptions behind the affirmative research product that the plan relies on. Otherwise, fundamental questions go unanswered. Is ideal theory just, or should our worldview be centered around non-naturalism? The ballot is decided by who shapes more ethical subjectivities in response to settler colonialism. They considered our primary piece of offense. That's Henderson. Colonialism functions through the iteration of smooth spaces in which settler subjects unconsciously relay colonial logics and assumptions, making them appear as common sense. These patterns can only be broken by questioning the performance of the 1AC, and they say fairness, but we are fair and predictable. Every card in the AC was cut with the assumption that their philosophy and calculus are good, which means that they know they'll have to defend their scholarship. Mooting ground is inevitable. That's how debate works. Every 1AC clashes with a selected part of the app, like process counter plans and contest solvency, and this has conceded framework. Theory concedes everything. Even if we are slightly unfair, we have demonstrated that fairness has become a guide to protect the violent logics of the debate, which turned its terminal impacts of engagement. An ethical and unfair game that reorients our subjectivities is better than one that is complicit in violence and outweighs on portability. Now, the Lemon proper. They say Henderson is all causes, but all causes are not unique to debate. The debate is the only place where high schoolers can engage in critical literature, like things like settler colonialism, which is much more radical than generic high school curriculum. And third, switch high debate does not require you to read racist arguments. You can be ethical on both sides by reading a critical affirmative. Four, some debaters read arguments they don't believe in, but Henderson means that debate influences us subconsciously, which means conscious choices like winning are not relevant if we become more ethical over time. And five, the anti-indigeneity debating something, not making contention, does not mean that we should ignore it, given that it has massive implications on how the world has been constructed. 6, of course, no author is writing about debate, but only our model is a way to consider the flaws in your research. You can garner offense. You just need to defend what your method is. 7, settlers can read Swickle. A, otherwise agreements racism when debating white debaters, because you know they can never call you out, but B, there are very few debaters within the circuit, so it means that Settler Colonialism would never be read. And C, the links to the app outweigh because they structured the entire app and it was much larger part of the round. And the thesis stuff, we'll skip it. We don't need to win psychoanalysis, but they have dropped the US as a deep and dark history of colonialism, so we'll move to the link proper. The sort of the next argument they make about the link turn, on the alternative. A, we are not saying that the alternative is an ideal world. Native methodologies and native spiritualities are plural, and it is a research method, not a world that we are physically imagining through fiat. It is, and either way, the alternative was conditional, so we're kicking it. You don't have to evaluate it. You have to evaluate the app if it was racist or not, and the links versus the link turns, and the sort of ideal theory prior question. They have not answered the fundamental question of Mills. Ideal theory is a colorblind abstraction from the extent of 500 years of colonial violence that cannot be reversed by the very same Enlightenment philosophy that justified it in the first place. It is incapable of generating productive political strategies unique to the particularities of indigenous Americans whose relationship to society is diametrically opposed to that of settlers. Ahistorical universalism cannot formulate obligations to tear down settled institutions because it cannot even address that they exist. As the true nature of oppression is ignored, it is further compounded daily. Now, goal setting is not possible if you don't know what structures we are moving into. So, reject the firm. The easiest way to understand the ideal theory link is to ask yourself questions. What does the affirmative say we should do about decolonization? What does it say about why settlers insist on making themselves native? How can people ever actually follow the affirmative if we cannot recognize how settler colonialism structures and shapes their entire life? It means that it constrains how the form of ethics of the 1AC. The case page proper will start on induction. 1. If I drop my water bottle, we know it is going to drop on the ground. Similarly, robust studies prove that we can predict things over time, which is why we have structured our entire world around it. 2. Double line. If ideal theory is false, then you are racist for ignoring foreseeable consequences, or ideal theory is true, then consequences are a reliable basis for ethics because everyone will be a perfect predictor, which in the topically will turn the affirmative. And the non-natural evidence. Racism is a side constraint to understanding what kinds of ethics we should consider, which means that even if someone was a white supremacist, we would intuitively reject their understanding of the political world because it is not something that is intuitive. Their political ideology should not inform politics. So no, yet lived experience can influence politics. We just have to understand and use and sort of critically analyze it. The offense page proper. This is going to be super important because not only is it going to independently prove the ideal theory, like it proves that the 1AC is incapable of generating obligations that are capable of dealing with the real world and how institutions like the ICC actually function, but it will independently turn all of the affirmative offense, even if they beat back the K. We'll extend 2 arguments why the ICC enables the United States to take over and persecute countries in the global south. The first is a Chomsky evidence. Bolstering U.S. involvement with the court incentivizes it to use its Security Council membership to refer hostile actors in the global south. That's proven by the case against Libya, where they referred them for the case of imposing regime change on Gaddafi. Second, Kendall, existential fear of a reduced budget enables the U.S. to garner full political control of the court via financial contributions and control exactly what is on the ICC's docket. That magnified by the risk of sanctions imposed on the court by officials like the Trump administration. Historical measures by the prosecutor prove that enables the U.S. to determine the court's agenda and why Western allies have fundamentally persecuted solely African nations. Now, their only argument is that the A98 is not the Rome Statute, but the Rome Statute makes them accede to all of the articles within the ICC, which includes Article 98, which means that every single piece of evidence that we have talked about, and the U.S. cannot be held accountable, even though it can hold other countries accountable, because A98 loopholes mean that the court doesn't have jurisdiction where existing domestic agreements conflict. That means the U.S. is shielded from ICC, given that American treaties, like commitments towards Israel or the Hague Invasion Act, mean that it can follow other obligations. The round is exceptionally clear. There are 3 layers. First, you evaluate K framework. If we are winning K framework, then you think about if the affirmative framework is something that is racist or problematic. The ideal theory link says it does. Even if they answer the ideal theory link, we have proved it independently on the case page. They have to answer that. Even if they answer K framework is flawed, we still turn the affirmative, and the topic link turns the app. There's 3 places to vote now.
Okay. So, what link does... So first of all, does the tuner do what we expected it to do? Yes or no?
Basically.
Matthew, what do you think?
I think sort of, yeah.
The tuner does basically what we predicted, right? What's the top of the tuner? It was K case, right? What's at the top of the K page in the 2R? Shubang.
An overview about why the K come first. And
Okay.
responses to fairness.
So what part of the flow is that?
Overview.
And what's he extending?
Basically the role of ballot.
The framework interp stuff, right? Like the roll of the ballot. So he's saying that if the affirmative is racist, they should lose, right? And then he extends his argument for why that's the case, right? That's which piece of evidence? Henderson, right? Then he answers all of the arguments that the AF makes for why you should not do that, right? So he line by lines the answers to that. Then he does what? Which argument does he go for?
The ideal
Which
theory
argument
link.
does he go for? Yeah, Mills, right? The link argument is next, right? So he starts at the top where we said that he might start, right, which is framework. Then he goes for the link argument, and it seems as though that is the argument that he likes for the K for why the app is racist, right? So we said we're not sure which link because all of them were responded to. Harris thinks that his best link argument is this one, and this is the 2R that he decides to give, right? Which is a perfectly reasonable decision. Then, what happens? After he extends the link argument, what is answered beyond that?
The answer is that the argument Spencer made about like how the link across the link is working.
Right, so he answers the responses to the link, right? So we see a pattern here, right? You extend an argument that frames the debate, then you answer the responses to that argument, right? Then you move on to the next important argument that frames the debate. In this case, it would be the link. Then you answer the arguments that respond to that argument, right? Then after the link, he says, I'm going to answer all of the arguments that the affirmative made on the critique that might answer the K, right? So he answers things like induction fails. He answers things like, goal setting argument. He answers like a constitutivism argument, right? So he answers some arguments that might apply to the critique in general, right? He answers this other argument that's like settlers can't read Swickle, right? So he answers these arguments because any of these arguments could be cross-applied to his link argument or to the K framework page, right? As a reason for why the K is wrong. So he answered general arguments that apply, that might be used in the 2AR because Harris does not have another speech, right? Which means he is at the whims of the 2AR. He has to answer all of the arguments that he thinks might apply to the negative, right? And then what's the last thing Harris does that we mentioned before the 2AR? Yeah, so he extends arguments for why the responses to the terms in the app were insufficient, right? And says exactly what we said before the speech, right? Which is, if we win a reason for why Kant negates, then that's an independent link argument because it proves that the ICC is racist, right? And it proves that Kant flows neg, right? Which is something that Sierra will have to deal with because the only offense for the app in this round is like the resolution, right? It's the reason why the ICC is good under a Kantian framework, which means that Harris has done some layering. And then what's the last thing Harris does that is very important at the very end of the speech?
Judge instructions.
Judge instruction, right? He frames the round for you. He says, look, here's how the round breaks down, okay? This is important, again, because this is your last speech. It's your last opportunity to say, this is what you should think about in terms of why you should be voting nay, right? That is very important because it encapsulates the speech. It tells the judge how to evaluate all of the arguments that you have just made and says, this is how, even if I'm winning this first argument. Even if I'm not winning this first argument, I'm winning this second argument. Even if I'm not winning the second argument, I'm winning this third argument, which is what we call layering, right? Making it so that the 2AR has to go through multiple different arguments in order to tell a story as to why you should vote for them, not just why they're winning an individual argument. Any questions about the 2AR?
Wait, could you explain like the double line thing?
So I think the argument he made was if ideal theory, first is that ideal theory is wrong, right? In which case that the app is racist because they're winning the link argument, or it's the case that ideal theory is correct, in which case the consequences fails arguments cannot be true because we would imagine a world in which we are perfect at predicting things. So the app gets out of criticisms of the Kant framework by saying, well, it doesn't matter if we can't tell if other people are reasoners because ideal theory is true, which means in a world in which we were reasoners, we would just be able to assume that the other person is a reasoner in an ideal circumstance, right? And so here it says, well, that should apply to the negative about predicting consequences, right?
One more thing, I'll just say quickly before lecture starts. But the reason that the ideal theory link was chosen instead of the other one is because it goes very well with the topic, or the case term that was extended, that was also linked to the K. These two things would not have, the case term would not have interacted very well with the argument about like rational, irrational dualisms, because they just don't really have that much to do with each other. I mean, you could spin it that way, but it just makes it so maybe that would be a link where I would spin the whole debate on that just link. But I wanted to go for two, so I went for the two that were compatible.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay.
You should frame this debate through the fact that they have dropped tab solved. They've conceded that technically litigating accusations of in-round violence is problematic. We won't change our minds if we're called racist for dropping an argument, but the judge dropping us for racism absent technical evaluation tells us we're actually problematic, which is the only thing that resolves anything. This means they get no links to representations because all of those links should be staked, and they have not staken the round yet, which means that they don't get access to this. This means that it's a method debate about who solves racism best and has the best performative obligation to reject racism, which they have no method for because they have not extended the alternative. Conceded that constructivism is meta-ontology. It determines what features are relevant for ontology in the first place, which my theory says that are the things that pass the reduction test, the determination of whether a specific entity can exist absent a specific feature. You drop that this means that there can be nothing intrinsically bad about the state or anything because indigenous people existed prior to European innovation, and therefore indigeneity physically cannot be considered the subject, which is the only non-arbitrary basis for ethics, and it allows us to say that all people ought to be treated the same because every person is a practical reasoner, which was dropped, which means that the AC is the best method for resolving violence, even if you think we're losing the topic link, which I'll answer in a second. The other way you need to frame this debate is that they do not have offense under our framework because intentions are the only thing relevant. The one AC took a clear stance that we do not care about consequences, and they are not contextualized why violations of agency matter consequentially, only why we have said that it matters from an intense basis, which is dropped. You conceded the standard is consistency with the principles of the categorical imperative that respect agency universally enforced through a collection of wills that make up the state. Drop the offense. The IC is a neutral arbitrator which rules on terminal violations of dignity and rational reflection, which is key to resolving moral uncertainty. Drop the Anderson evidence. Induction fails. The logic of prediction is circular. In order to prove induction works, we must use induction. I say that we know induction works because it has in the past. However, there's no logical certainty that a situation will ever be replicated exactly. The 2NR is completely new on all of the arguments for why consequences work. They say that it works because of ideal theory, but this does not answer our argument about the logic of induction. The idea that we can predict perfectly in the ideal world does not answer the idea that induction is a valid basis for ethics. I cannot say that people are not practical reasoners, but we should assume they're practical reasoners. That doesn't make any sense, but we can say that because they are practical reasoners, they are. They have not one reason for why induction is logical in the ideal world. They have one reason why predictions work in the ideal world, which are two separate arguments that the one here clearly delineated when answering the Dowdy evidence. The second thing is the Penn example. It's new in the 2NR, but it's also wrong. You aren't certain about how it will be dropped, where it will be dropped, or even that it will be dropped because you don't know that your hands will work when you do drop it. Now, which should be sufficient to answer this argument, which takes out the link. Both of them are intrinsic. They are about the U.S.'s agenda when joining the ICC, but not about the ICC being intrinsically good or bad, and they have not contextualized these arguments to our framework, so you should have a high burden of explanation for the 2NR when the 1AR and 1AC had the same piece of offense that was very clear and contextualized to the categorical imperative. They've also just dropped the argument 5 times that misapplications of things do not disprove their truth. Just because people join the ICC and use it wrong does not mean that the ICC is intrinsically wrong, which was a dropped argument on like 5 other flows about misapplications of the framework, which seems pretty reasonable to apply to a link that's about the same concept, the ideal theory link. You drop that. A comprehensive theory of justice requires both ideal and non-ideal theory because they do not trade off with each other but are complementary. You can imagine a non-ideal world and an ideal world to compare the non-ideal world to, and there's no reason why they're competitive or distinct, but their argument about abstraction is wrong. The ideal theory has been used for examples of goal setting and good arguments. For example, the Haitian Revolution was used and built off of normativity and ideal theory. It's inclusive, not exclusive.